Thank you, Alex. Good morning to everybody. We have 4 speakers coming up now, and the subject we're dealing with is how to deal with alternative media, partial media, and propaganda. And Alex was just explaining to us there, by partial media, it is a section of media which is promoting a particular position or particular angle, and we might discuss whether that has to be explicit or whether it may be implicit. What I might do is I might get a short opening remark from each of the 4 speakers, and perhaps we could start with Balázs from the Hungarian Press Council, because Balázs has been a mainstream of the AIPCE for many years and is a person we greatly respect and trying to operate in particularly difficult circumstances. So perhaps if Balázs would give some opening remarks, we might start that way.
Yeah, hello, and sorry for being late a bit. It's nice to see all your faces that I haven't seen for so long. And thank you, Peter. It's difficult to beat up this topic, but I think we can all agree, and I assume this is not a Hungarian-only notion, that the media landscape has changed so much in the past 15-20 years. Also also regarding bias, impartiality, propaganda. And I think that this has partly to do, of course, with the onlineization, digitalization of the media. But also, like, we first started to sense, like, when was that, 10 to 15 years ago, that there's kind of a new modus vivendi in politics that kind of tries to undermine the credibility of the media. I think we were a bit unarmed against that. I'm talking about us, of course, in Hungary, but I see this as a global notion. On the other hand, some countries are luckier, some unluckier in this sense, but there's a clear trend to it. If you look at the global picture, so kind of what we had this comfortable position and a hard but comfortable role to play in the society in the previous decades, that it was believed that most of the media outlets, even if, you know, sharing different views of the world, of politics, whatever, but they do serve kind of the same goal, and they do an honest job from their own perspectives, and that has been started to be undermined, as I said, like 10 to 15 years ago. Of course, with social media and all these all the noise around media content, all the undignified debates, and I don't just mean online comments or something, but all these the whole context of the media has changed, and it's been put in a context that we can't control anymore. So people share the articles that we produce in all kinds of contexts that we have no control over. So in times of the legacy media, we also kind of produced the context of all kinds of journalistic efforts. The role of editors was much bigger in kind of creating this context. We had a control over kind of a linear set of pieces. You could control the kind of the rundown or the running order of the articles, and also that kind of it was easier to create kind of a balanced view of the world in a closed universe that was a newspaper. Now all the pieces that we create, they kind of have their own life, and they are put in all kinds of different universes, and the meaning of them are can change and are changed as they are put in different contexts, different narratives. So, you know, someone shares any article anywhere, even if they just put, you know, like one sentence to it, that already changes the whole context of the article, because it's kind of meant to serve the message the user who shares it wants to deliver. But also this kind of context that has changed was absolutely taken advantage by politicians and politics, who were kind of probably felt that they are too vulnerable to the media, and they turned the whole game around, and now the media became vulnerable to them. And by this I mean that politicians tried to create their own kind of media universes, media contexts, and by that I don't think that the primary goal is to you know, have media outlets that operate to serve their own agenda. The more deeper meaning of this is that if you create as many alternate universes as you can, and at the end it will be very difficult to tell which universe is real and which is unreal. And by this they kind of totally ruin the credibility of the media.
Balázs, it would be interesting to get a view from a stable democracy, if I can use that expression. Elin, with the Norwegian Press Council, does this resonate with you, the description that Balázs gives of subverting the media by governments? Does that have any relevance to a very stable democracy like the Norwegian one?
Maybe not so much, but we have some kind of the similar issues that we discuss, and of course the big questions asked here is a big one, is how to deal with propaganda media. And I think that one of our main objective is to protect and strengthen independent and ethical journalism, and it's more important than ever to talk about what journalism is and what it's not. And I think that is more important now than it's ever been before, just because of that everyone can publish, everyone can pretend to be journalists, but not everyone works in an ethical way. And even though we have probably some different definition of what journalism is, I think that we should agree on some main criteria. They could be to strive to be the best obtainable version of the truth, like Carl Bernstein said. It should be independent and not propaganda. It should tell different sides of the story. It should not harm people unnecessary. And I think it's important that it should be transparent, so the public can hold the press accountable. And the few years now, we have found it more and more important to teach the public, both in schools and the adult media users, about the need to be critical of the sources. And I think the public should learn more how to differ propaganda and activism dressed up as journalism from real journalism. And I would say that a recent study in Norway has shown that that those who have the most difficulties in doing so, to differ what is what, is from around 60 years and older. Younger people has a better understanding today. They are more better to be critical of the sources. But I would also point out we changed our rules on how to deal with alternative or propaganda media back in 2018. And before we handle complaints against all media, regardless of their relations with the ethical standards or their connection to the Press Association. But after 2018, you can now file complaints against all media who's obliged to follow the Code of Ethics and is led by an independent editor-in-chief and is attached to our Press Association. And the result of this is that now we handle complaints from, I would say, well over 95% of the media, but there is a few that we do not handle anymore. And one of those categories is a small number of propaganda media, defined as online media with a clear agenda, who don't follow the Code of Ethics. They talk to their echo chambers solely. And often they advertise for their media channels with statements like they provide the real truth, the not censored truth, opposed to the mainstream media. And another category we do not handle is media sites or online sites who is run by big companies or concerns who maybe uses journalistic presentation, but where the content is a way of advertising for their services. And then we have a discussion with a field of bloggers, influencers, and independent podcasts. We do handle complaints against those who are attached to the media companies, but not otherwise. And I think this is a big dilemma, you know, deciding who's in or who's out. Because on the one side, we want as many media as possible to join our self-regulatory system. But on the other side, propaganda media seems to just want to dress up as journalists without having any ambition to really change. And taking them in can also potentially weaken the whole system and the trust that people can and should have in journalism. And so far we have come to the conclusion that our main task is to protect those who want to be ethical and independent.
So that's interesting. Perhaps we might hear from Thomas Walach. Thomas was an academic, but he now edits a publication called Zackzack, which, as I understand it, is satirical. And that's interesting because in some ways that's kind of halfway between mainstream journalism and entertainment, but also it can perhaps thread a very definite ideological line. So Thomas, what would your observations be?
Thank you. Well, first of all, I would like to say that, Elin, I completely agree with you on your characterization of journalism. I think that's something we could all agree on as a fundament of our discussion. There were some interesting points you said about the Code of Ethics and press associations. We have a peculiar situation that would like to join the Austrian Press Association but as a online-only media outlet, we cannot. It's just not possible. The rules don't allow it. So we follow the Code of Ethics of Austria's Press Association, but without being able to become a member. That's a kind of a peculiar situation, and I think one could think about if that situation is something that we wish for.
But Thomas, sorry to interrupt, does that mean that you are unregulated in the sense, if I wish to complain about your magazine, I have nowhere to go to?
You couldn't. You simply couldn't. And we find that very regrettable. I think that's something the Austrian Press Association should change very quickly, because it's easy to do. They should just
I think, Thomas, that's unusual. I think most press councils accept online only publications as just as legitimate, platform neutral as it were, just as legitimate as print newspapers. So maybe that's fairly unique to Austria. Maybe Alex or Edwin might confirm that. But sorry to interrupt you, keep going.
Yeah, no problem. As you said, that's probably a unique situation. In Austria, we have some unique situations regarding the media system as a whole. State subsidiary for media comes mostly for print media. And it's not a lot of money that is officially given to different media outlets. It's by far getting surpassed by government AdWords. To give you an example, last year, the official state subsidiaries for print media were 8.7 million euros a year. But the government spent more than 200,000 euros each day for government AdWords. And they more or less openly declare that they try to give the money to those media outlets that are friendly to them. A few months ago, we managed to get hold of a text message that a government official wrote to his minister, who was a new minister, and he didn't, so to speak, he didn't know how things worked. And he wrote him more or less openly. I've translated that. We are buying a lot of goodwill with the media with the help of our advertisement budget, which is much bigger than the official media subsidy. And that's why we founded our online medium, zackzack. We're taking no money, no government money at all, on purpose, because we think that that would harm our independence. Ironically, that leads to us being characterized as alternative media, whereas I would say that should be normal standard, that you are not economically dependent on government money, but are only dependent on the money your readers pay you. That's the state of things at the moment. And I think what Balázs said about media being vulnerable, that's also true for the Austrian situation, for Austria, because many media outlets could not economically survive without government money. In other countries, they would have probably just died, just have given up. In Austria, that's not the case. In Austria, they are kept alive, which is a good thing, but kept alive by the government and their advertisement money, which automatically creates dependence. And even if there are many, many journalists who try to be independent, I think it goes without saying that if the whole publication is dependent on the goodwill of the government, that this independence can only go so far.
Daniela, I might get a view now from Daniela Kraus. She is Secretary General of the Press Club in Vienna, Concordia. Daniela, is government support, either directly or indirectly through placing of advertising, is that creating a perception that the Austrian media isn't independent of government?
Yes, hello. I think the perception is one very important aspect, but the reality is another one. So there is, to a certain extent, I totally agree to Mr. Walach, there is dependence upon government money, and what the huge problem from our perspective is that it is not transparent who the money is given to and why. Many Austrian newspapers would have a huge problem without this government money. So we advocate for media funding, but media funding is something completely different from government advertising. Because for the funding, there are criteria. I mean, I don't think that they are strong enough in Austria and that they make sense in every aspect, but at least there is criteria. But for the government advertising, and by the way, it's not only government, it's also like cities, communities, etc. There is no criteria and nobody knows why they are advertising where, and you can't control it and the public can't control it. So that's kind of a Zwickmühle. Well, it's a difficult situation for the media. But
Catch-22.
Sorry?
I think catch-22 is the
Thank you.
catch.
Because on the one hand, it is absolutely crucial to talk about the problem of government advertising. On the other hand, Peter, what you're saying is it is undermining the credibility of the media when you're talking about it. So that's really a problem. Yeah, I mean, I could go on because there were many things I can totally relate to, particularly in what Elin was saying, but I make a point, and if you ask me, I will go on talking.
We'll come back to you, Daniela. Balázs, you spoke to us before about how the government in Hungary withdrew advertising from newspapers which were hostile to government or independent of government, and just directed all the advertising revenue to sympathetic newspapers. Is that still the case today? I'm not hearing you, Balázs. Have we lost Balázs?
Yes. Yeah, no,
Oh,
I'm
okay.
here. Sorry, it was just the unmute button that I needed to push. So, yes, this is absolutely the case still. And, but these days it's not just the sympathetic papers. I mean, in the meanwhile, growingly in the past decade, virtually the government, technically like a foundation, has taken ownership over a big chunk of the market here, including all the rural papers, for example, and one of the two national commercial TV stations, and also a big chunk of the online media. It's over 400 titles that we're talking about. So it's more than sympathetic, it's kind of directly controlled media. Yeah, I think that kind of all other media clearly took a strategy to avoid vulnerability through kind of the distorted advertising market, to increase their direct revenues from the audience. So most of kind of the non-government controlled media, I was thinking about using the independent word, but yeah, some of them of course are independent, some are not, but not controlled by the government, but by somebody else. So they are trying to increase their revenues from the audience, and there are kind of some good developments in this way, especially last year, because of COVID, because of the meltdown of Index that was at the time of I don't know if you know the case of Index.
No, tell us.
No, I don't want to be too long about it, but last summer, the online news outlet with the biggest audience had huge internal conflict over issues of independence, bias, and government influence over the content. And at the end of that, first the editor-in-chief was sacked, and then the whole newsroom left, and they created a new media outlet called Telex. And Telex was completely funded by the audience. So it was a crowdfunded campaign which was way the biggest success in crowdfunding, in media crowdfunding in Hungary. But that also had to open the doors for others for crowdfunding. So this was kind of the case that kicked in the door of crowdfunding in Hungary. So in the past year, direct revenues from the audience, either by crowdfunding or by subscription, or different models of subscription. So it's some do it by limiting access for non-subscribers. Some do it with keeping it open but asking for donations through campaigns. Either way, but there was a significant growth in the willingness of the audience to finance media directly. So I think this is clearly the way to avoid that kind of vulnerability that we heard also from Austria, where obviously this kind of financial dependence on the government's goodwill doesn't bring with it influence over the content. But if you are dependent, that's kind of an invitation on the long run for content control. I mean, obviously that's the Hungarian experience, and I don't wish that to
I'd be interested, Balázs,
other colleagues.
I'd be interested, Balázs, in hearing about other countries, about how government advertising for things like road safety or COVID or whatever else is directed towards newspapers, because certainly in Ireland, the government hands over that responsibility to advertising agencies. So they say they have no act in determining what newspaper gets what advertising. It's all done by agencies, and the agencies are only motivated by the need to to maximize the audience and get the advertisement to the correct audience. So Elin, what's the experience in Scandinavia with government-funded advertising and which newspapers it goes to?
Well, there are a few years back, there were long lists about which local newspapers, which regional newspapers, which national newspapers, and furthermore and later online sites that they could and should advertise in. But this is an ongoing discussion now. There are no specific rules for it, but I would say that this does not contain a lot of money either. So it's not the biggest issue here. The biggest issue here with advertisement is Google and Facebook's taking a continuously bigger chunk of all the advertisements income. And I would also like to say something about the dependence, like Thomas mentioned, the dependence of government support or government money. And I think that at least in Norway, some of the media support has been very important, especially the last 5 years. And there is now a system of zero-rate VAT tax for both print and digital subscriptions. And this has been a huge success for increasing digital subscription. And again, the media are not so dependent on advertisement like there was before. And I think it has created a much better environment to that the advertisers, now the subscribers, now finance over 50% of the digital media. So this is a good way for a media support, I think, because there is an arm's length between the politicians in state and the media. It's much more problematic when it goes directly into supporting this media outlet.
It would be interesting to hear from Thomas how zackzack is funded. Is it funded by advertising or is it funded by subscription?
We do advertise, but that doesn't play a big role. We are more or less completely funded by crowdfunding. So our audience funds our publication, which is not always easy because we have to ask for donations regularly. but nevertheless, we have no paywall because we want as many people as possible to be able to read our publication. So that's all crowdfunded, and it's working out just fine at the moment. We're hoping that it stays that way.
Can I ask you a question to Thomas?
Certainly.
Yeah, just why aren't you, you said crowdfunding and not the digital subscription?
Because we basically don't want a paywall. We just want everybody to be able to read what we put out there. Mm. So we have actually we have a subscription system in place, and we offer goodies for subscribers, but basically everyone can read our publication.
We might move the discussion on a bit. Daniela, what is your perception of the effectiveness of press councils and media councils in dealing with new social media, in dealing with the evolving platforms which have emerged? Because I think most press councils grew up, as it were, at a time when print dominated, and now we're living in a world where obviously online dominates. Are press councils becoming sort of dinosaurs and less relevant as time goes on?
Oh no, I totally disagree, but not only because I am at this meeting, I would also do it at the different associations meeting. I think press councils can have really a crucial role in what Elin pointed out, and I think that's really important, and I will come back to it in which way we as a press club have to deal with it, in defining and communicating what is journalism and what is the difference to other forms of communication. This is an awful task because it's really hard, and it's like a moving target, and you have define and to redefine all the time. But I think this was one of the mistakes that media and journalists did in the past, and failed to start communicating transparently what they are doing and why journalism is something special and something different. And by the way, sometimes the problem is also that the practice is not as well done as the theory. In theory, we would like to have done, but I think one of the role of the press councils is to communicate what is journalism, and that also pushes back to the question who can be part and who should be regulated by press councils. And one last word, I have to deal a lot with this. I mean, it's different but we have members, and these are journalists. And so you have to apply to become a member of the press club. So in every board meeting, we have a list of people who apply to become members, and we discuss who is a journalist. So it's a similar problem, and we are dealing with it all the time. But I think it's really a crucial issue. And if we are not transparent about how we work and why the audience can rely on us, then we are lost. One last point, if you allow me, I think something is very important in what Thomas said, and again, it comes back to what Elin said. I think we have one chance, and that is an alliance with the audience.
I think you're absolutely right, Daniela. You raise an interesting point, and that is the definition of journalism, and then how do we deal with the Facebooks, the Twitters of this world, where 99% of what appears on postings there is coming from non-journalists, it's coming from people who don't perhaps understand objectivity, don't understand principles of impartiality and fairness, and who don't see themselves as journalists. They just see themselves as having a platform to express their views. Is that activity something that can be regulated within the mainstream of press and media councils?
I don't think so, but I mean, you are the experts on press councils, but I don't think that it can and should be regulated because it's out of the scope of press councils. And in a way, you would fail to make the difference if you do it.
Balázs, the threats to the independence of media and the the lowering of the public perception of the media in Hungary, is that driven by social media, or is it driven just by specific government activities?
Well, I would say that the government efforts probably wouldn't have been that successful without this global change that Facebook brought. Also in what I refer to in altering the whole context of the media, but also in terms of what I think Elin mentioned before, the very fast growing chunk of the advertising market that Facebook and Google is taking, because this together with the government's efforts created this kind of what Aidan White usually calls the perfect storm for the media. So yes, only one or two of these probably could have been managed, but all these together had enough power to destroy the business model, the credibility, the whole balance of the media market here.
Thomas, is there a distinction to be made between stable democracies and the media and unstable or emerging democracies? Do you find that there effectively, for press councils, there's two worlds? There's the world of relatively stable democracies and the world of relatively unstable democracies, and the problems faced by are quite different.
I certainly think so, but I'm not sure which role the press council could play in defending media outlets in an unstable democracy or in an authoritarian regime, because basically the safety mechanisms in place that a press council provides are self-control mechanisms, and they are not in place. That's not their priority in order to defend freedom of press as such. So the working environment is certainly very different, but I do not see in which way the political environment enables or disables the press council to make its work, because press council's priority must always be an instrument of self-control of the media, and that's probably not the biggest problem in authoritarian regimes or in managed democracies.
Yeah, that's it. Elin, from Norwegian perspective, is there a way in which press councils can draw a meaningful distinction between what is essentially journalism and what is essentially just frequently uninformed commentary?
This is difficult, but because there are no clear definition of this, but we have discussed this amongst all the press organizations in Norway who are our members the last few years, and they have changed their rules. So who can be a member? Like if a journalist applies to the journalist union, he or she has to show that they work independent, that they are obliged to the code of ethics. The same thing for an editor who wants to be a member of the Editors Association. He has to do the same thing, and the publisher has to do the same thing. And so we have a system where we are kind of an umbrella organization. So when we know how we can handle complaints against by who is member of our members, again, if you know what I mean. Those who are member of the publishers or the editors or the journalist associations are within the system. I'm not. I'm skeptic if we confuse freedom of expression with ethical journalism, because I think those are not compatible. You know, the latter is constrained freedom of expression. Journalism is something else, and I think we should use much more time to communicate the ideals of good journalism in schools, in public, in universities. And we talked about this in an earlier meeting. For example, how the students are taught about ethics, how there's a lot of project going on now here regarding schools to reach young children with the meaning of ethical journalism, and to be critical of the sources. And I think those things are like I said before, more important than ever, and that's our role. In addition, of course, to handling complaints as we have always done. And I would also say that we have to do it in every kind of channel the journalism comes in. It's not important for us at all. It has to do with the principle that goes on regardless of the platforms or the channels.
There was discussions sometime earlier last evening in the informal group about the growth of the concept of online safety commissioners, where governments recognizing that harm can be caused online and are moving towards positions of introducing online safety commissioners. Is this a threat to freedom of expression, and is it more specifically a threat to the independence of press councils? Because if there is a statute-based commission for online safety, there clearly is going to be an overlap into the self-regulation of press councils. Daniela, you might have a view on that.
Actually, Peter, I don't.
Right. I'll go back to Elin. Do you think that the independence of press councils can be threatened by these proposals?
Well, I would say that we haven't had exactly those kind of propositions from government at all, but they talk about how to strengthen the environment on social media, how people should talk to each other. There's been a discussion on what is legal or illegal to say, and in a way we have to be a part of that discussion, because it's dangerous if they try to control everything, and you know, and it could potentially harm the media and the press council's work, but I haven't experienced it here so far, at least.
Yes.
Sorry, Peter.
Go ahead.
May I ask to the press council officials here that I'm very interested in? I'm sorry to interrupt you. Is that all right for you? Okay. In my view, a big threat for the credibility of the media in the last, say, 20 years or so, was that sometimes, and sometimes rightfully, media outlets were seen by the audience as not critical enough. Just think of the Iraq invasion and the whole mess the New York Times found itself in, and so on. And we got many problems with media outlets who willingly or even eagerly subvert to message control in Austria too. So does this concern press councils at all? How do you cope with media not being critical, not being a monitor of power? Does anybody complain about that? How would you deal with such complaints?
Perhaps, Thomas, we might widen that out to the other people who are listening into this discussion. And maybe Edwin, if any of the other people attending this would like to defend their press councils and defend their the freedom of their media, might like to contribute. So I don't control who comes in, but Edwin, perhaps you can bring in anybody who's commenting on that.
It looks like he's talking to someone.
Oh, sorry, I haven't got him in vision here, so I can't get him for that. interesting enough, we at the moment here in Ireland, we have a small group of people who are protesting against vaccinations. They're opposed to people being vaccinated. And one of the side issues they demonstrate about is the lack of independence of the media. So they say the public service broadcasting and the main newspapers are tools of the government, that they are not critical enough. Now, this is just about the issue of vaccination, but in fact, I think behind it is something bigger than that, and that is that somehow, as Thomas says there, that the media is no longer a fourth estate. It has lost that function, and it has become really part of the establishment and too close to government and too close to those in power and those with privilege. Perhaps, perhaps Daniela, you might talk about that, because clearly from sort of Middle Europe, it's an interesting consideration.
Yeah, I just want to add something. I mean, because Thomas is talking from an Austrian perspective, and as we might be seen as a perfect European democracy, I mean, we really have some issues, and we have one serious issue, and that is interventions directly from the Chancellery to the editors-in-chief. Sometimes, which for colleagues from Germany, for example, is totally unbelievable. The Chancellor is on the phone and calls your editor-in-chief because he doesn't like what was written or he's critical about it. So, so I think, Thomas, maybe I understood you wrongly, but the question is, can somebody complain about that? So we are not on, I don't think that we only have to talk about weirdos, excuse me, going on the street and protesting and thinking and spreading some totally nonsense theories about vaccinations, but we really have to talk about the problem that exists. And so
that was my point.
Yeah.
We get by anti-vaxxers all the time. Why aren't you against vaccinations? You're always so critical of the government, but you advertise vaccinations. Yeah, of course we do, because I don't need to explain that here. But Daniela, what you just mentioned, that was what I had in mind exactly.
Yeah. So what is it comes out or it becomes public that there is an intervention by a politician to a totally serious newsroom. So what happens? I mean, who deals with that?
Yeah. Well, I could say in Norway that would be a violation of the Editorial Freedom Act, and should and could also been seen as a law case. There's an editorial freedom agreement between the Editors Association and the Publishers Association, and then this agreement has been adopted as law to not be able to interfere with the editorial freedom from states, governments, advertisers, owners, whatever. And this has been very important, especially to those media outlets who are run, for example, by an organization, that they should not be able to interfere. We don't have any, I don't have any examples of the Prime Minister interfering directly in a newsroom.
Could I go to Balázs there? Balázs, in Hungary, is the interference direct, as you know, the Chancellor raising the telephone to an editor and saying, I don't like what you have, or is it more subtle than that?
No, it's much more subtle, and somehow it might sound strange as it is, but I would prefer, for example, the Prime Minister to phone directly, because that's at least a transparent action. But here kind of there is a whole, you know, system of practicing control. So there is no need to actually for any politician to phone directly. There's a whole kind of informal bureaucracy.
And would you say that's the same in neighboring countries like Poland?
Well, I don't have exact information on there, but what I know about Poland, that it's a bit different. So there it's if there are experiments to control the media or to influence it, that's more direct and transparent and touchable. So it's it can be it's much easier to identify as well, because that's more an exception than a rule. So the public media, I think, is different, because it's by definition it's got more government control over it in every country. But obviously there are public media outlets that that work fine and independently content-wise. But yeah, here in the region, if you mentioned Poland, or I could add the Czech Republic or Slovakia, we've seen harsh attempts to gain control over respective media outlets, or kind of the whole media spectrum. But still, I wouldn't say that the whole media landscape is kind of distorted.
Edwin, are there other people attending the conference who would like to contribute? Because I don't have access to my screen here, or do you want us to stay with our 4 speakers here?
I would like to say something.
Katrina, go ahead, from Cyprus.
I think that the question is not whether the establishment, we have increasingly there is an increasingly more intervention of the government or during the pandemic, but what we can do in a period of crisis. As I understand it, clearly there was a lot of intervention in the media during the pandemic, and the media took a clear stance in favor of vaccination. Isn't this right? I mean, most media have entered the campaign to support vaccination. So, but there is I think that we should look up, we should say that there is a general thing happening in the society that affects also the public opinion and affects the media. So the question is whether the media have become have accepted more of the intervention from the establishment, or is it just what do we do in periods of crisis to maintain a balance between 2 views, for example? I don't know if this makes sense.
It does, Katrina. Actually, I'm just thinking of my own experience here in Ireland. We have an expression here, which is to put on the green shirt. And what that means is when there is a major national crisis or major issue, people are expected to kind of toe the line and fall in behind the general view and not become dissenters. And that seems to work at odds with the fourth estate role of the media as always independent and always critical, where being critical is appropriate. Perhaps I might go back to Tomasz, because Tomasz, you're editing a satirical magazine, and by very definition, satirical magazines are anti-establishment. What's your experience?
Well, first of all, there is a misunderstanding there. Zack is not a satirical magazine, just satirical. We borrowed that from a right-wing politician. You might know him, Heinz-Christian Strache from the FPÖ, who fantasized in the infamous Ibiza video, who fantasized about getting control, obtaining control over the media, and he used this very Austrian expression, zack, 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 and so we use that as a title for our publication. Now we actually have an intense focus on investigative journalism, and in my experience, we're making the business very uncomfortable for a lot of people. We do that on purpose. That doesn't earn us many friends, either in the media nor in politics. But we think that's necessary to, in an early stage, oppose early signs of what you could call urbanization in Austria. I see an immediate danger that the Austrian system could fail in a few years. That's related to how the specific working environment for journalists is built in Austria. We already talked about the economic dependence on government money, but also on government favors. So politicians decide who gets good story, who gets a scoop, who doesn't, who is inside and who is outside. So Chancellor Kurz is famous for calling newspaper editors and explaining to them, literally, verbally, you're either my friend or you're my enemy. Echoing what George W. Bush said about putting on the green shirt with regards to the Afghanistan war. So I think that the Austrian media system, there is a certain danger of beginning urbanization, and we point that out day after day, and we're not making a lot of friends with that.
I see Lisbeth in Denmark has posted some comments about the Danish Press Council and the Media Liability Act. Perhaps you'd like to expand on that if you're still with us, Lisbeth. Maybe you muted your microphone because I can't hear any response.
Peter, maybe to interrupt you for a moment, Peter Knappen from Belgium also has a question.
Okay, fine. Peter?
Thank you. So I just wanted to mention, because Daniela said that press councils should define journalism and should define what journalism is. We have had a very interesting webinar about this 3 days ago, organized by the CDJ, the Belgian French-speaking Press Council. I'm from the Belgian Flemish-speaking Press Council. And there it was the same debate. What is the definition of journalism, and should we define journalism as press councils? So I defended the point of view that we shouldn't do it, that we should not define what is journalism, because I think it can pose a number of risks to our operations. Defining journalism is very, very difficult. I'm not going to repeat all my arguments from that webinar, but what we have to do is to define what is ethical journalism and what is responsible journalism. That, of course, we do every day, and that we make clear in our code of ethics and in our judgments about complaints. But defining journalism as such, I think it can pose some risks to our work, because we, as for instance the Flemish, but also the French speaking Press Council in Belgium, we also handle complaints against non-members. So, and then, yeah, we don't want to be the regulators of social media, but we can, of course, handle complaints about journalistic posts on social media. So that's the reason why we decide case by case. And 2 years ago, we did our survey in the framework of the media digital, how it's called, the EU project. And we asked to 36 press councils in Europe whether they had a definition of journalism or not. And 34 of the 36 don't have and don't want to have a definition because it's so difficult to define it. But what's important is to define what is ethical or responsible journalism. And that's what we do every day with our code of ethics and our judgments on complaints.
I see Alex has a little yellow hand up, so
Yeah,
maybe you want to say something, Alex.
Yes, Peter, I want to catch up with Peter. It's true that it's complicated to define journalism, but at the same time, as you said also, Peter, on a case-of-case basis, we have to deal with it, because sometimes we say we are responsible for this article or work, or we are not. So at the same time, we need some guidelines or some general rules to get the right differentiation between journalism and non-journalism. And then if that is the first step we have to deal with, and as a second step, we have to say if it's ethical or non-ethical. But I think we cannot avoid the question if something is journalism or it is not, because otherwise we would be responsible for anything on social media. So somehow we need some guidelines or some rules for the differentiation, at least internally, even if we say we don't give a definition to the outside world. But it's important, yeah, to think about it and to have some thoughts on it. And I want to add something to Daniela, because she said there is sometimes interference by politicians, also by the federal chancellor. That would be also an infringement of our code of ethics, because we have a provision which says that there should not be any interference from outside to the editorial department on the content, that even if it's afterwards, I think we could pick it up and make a decision. The problem is that you have to have some evidence. If the chancellor makes a call to the editor-in-chief and they just chat and they make a deal or whatsoever, we have no record of that and no evidence, so we cannot pick it up just like that, even if many people know that these calls are made on a regular basis. So that is the tricky thing. And then I have a question to the panel. How should we deal with this propaganda media? This oftentimes it's extreme right-wing media who are using conspiracy theories, but at the same time they give the impression that they are the only ones who dare to say the truth, and they are against the main so-called they call them mainstream media, and they give the impression of being a media outlet, but at the same time they just produce fake news, and they do not apply on the ethical rules at all. But at the same, I think there is some demand from the public that we judge it, but it's tricky because they just do completely something else, and they misuse journalism, and they don't follow any ethical rules. So that is quite tricky.
Alex, I see Elin wants to reply to that. Elin?
Yeah, I told you about the change of rules that we made a few years back now, but I would say that it's not their political color that it's the problem, because they could be right-wing or left-wing or whatever, as long as they strive to meet the ethical standards. But we had a case now. We had two rather similar right-wing media. One is part of the system, the other is not. And the other one, the other editor, he wanted to be a member of the Editors Association, and he's applied for membership a couple of times and has been rejected. And the other one has been become a member. And the difference between those two are that one shows an effort to reach the ethical standards, and they have to work with it. They need training, they need courses, but they want to learn, and they show this. And the other one does not, and they just want to dress up like journalism. And I think that's for us at least, it's important to be a press council also for those who's not quite there yet, but who's trying to be there.
I see Olga in Russian Press Council wants to comment on. Clearly the relationship between government and media in Russia is a matter of interest to us all. Olga.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Yeah, I wanted to applaud to Peter, who said the press councils are not to define what journalism is, but what ethical journalism is. Is like, I can't agree more, because we had complaints, and sometimes we would rule out a complaint against what we would consider like sheer propaganda. It's not journalism. We can't sort of analyze the case because it's purely not journalism, but we changed that approach because we see that public receives it as journalism. And sometimes, for instance, when there were sociological polls, like who's the most famous journalist to you, whom do you follow, and people would name people like media, but not necessarily journalists, like talk shows, state television, propagandists, and they perceive them as journalists. So it's good, I think, when we issue the decision, it's not so much for the person or for the media outlet or journalistic content that the complaint is about, but for broader public to sort of educate them what good journalism is. And even if you're a blogger, you don't, our decision doesn't have any legal sort of force to influence you, or even if you're a state media person, they just ignore our sessions and they don't pay attention. So we're not issuing sort of decisions against them or pro them, but for the audience, probably more to educate what's journalism, what's not journalism, and more so what's ethical journalism, what's good journalism. And if you're a good journalist, everybody wins in the situation. You have broader audience that trusts you, that follows you, and stuff like that, and sort of like turning the TV off, saying, "Oh, this is like sheer propaganda." So yes, that's a very slippery sort of question, tricky question, how to accept complaints against not like sort of official media or registered media. And I can say sort of it's an opposite situation, that most of the official media, and especially state-controlled media, are not, how to say, we don't have a jurisdiction, but they don't go to our sessions. They usually don't pay attention or only pay negative attention to our decisions. And they say, "Oh, you always, scold the state media or propaganda media. You always support sort of liberal or opposition media," which is not true. So
Olga, I see Pierre Gans in France, in Paris, has a little yellow hand up. We'd be interested
I was
to hear what the French experience on this is. And I also see Daniela and Thomas.
Wanted to say something also, Thomas.
Okay, so we let Pierre in first.
Yes, thank you for giving me the floor. I don't want exactly to answer to our Russian friend, but I was wondering exactly what is partial media or partial journalism. I think a journalist can have commitment. When a journalist, when a newspaper or a TV as it is driven by political commitment, is it wrong? Does it discredit journalists who work there? We think in the French CDGM that a journalist can be committed, having focuses inspired by values and principle. But in this case, the public interest is being informed is always superior of the particular interest that carries these values. And we think that when a journalist made choice primarily first dictated by the interest of these association parties and so on, he is out of the ethics. But in the other case, he made good journalists, and he can make good journalists and ethical journalism and have a commitment.
I think, Pierre, all our press councils would probably accept that editors and journalists are entitled to express their opinions and to editorialize, but they must also retain a commitment to objectivity, impartiality, truth, accuracy, etc. So I think there is a balance to be achieved there. It's when you move into the area of fake news or deliberate distortion that it becomes an issue if someone's ideology takes precedent over their other journalistic commitments. Thomas, you have your little yellow hand up there. Would you like to comment?
Thank you very much. I would like to throw my lot in with Pierre, because I think there's no such thing as impartial journalism. And when we regard certain issues, I think we could all agree on that. For example, if there was a choice between democracy and an authoritarian system, every journalist should choose democracy and cannot be impartial. So where to draw the line? That's not a question of absolutes, but a question of the context. But actually, I wanted to stress the point that Olga made, and I think that's very important and often overlooked inside the journalistic community. Effectively, the audience always decides who is journalism and what journalism is. We might have our own definitions, and we have good reasons for them, and also academia has their definitions, but whether this has any effect on the public is a totally different question. So we should always keep in mind that Walach said something very interesting right at the beginning. He said that there are different media universes. Well, in fact, there are as many media universes as there are people in the audience. And I think we too often overlook that.
There are two little yellow hands up. The first, Manfred in Germany, and then Daniela. As we haven't heard from Manfred before, perhaps Manfred, you might like to respond.
Just one remark, a kind of comment to the discussion from the German perspective is the Code of Ethics. The German Code of Ethics does not provide a rule that you have to report balanced. And the second, you have always to obey the rule that that it is forbidden to publish wrong facts by fake or by ignoring relevant information. That's all. I think this is a living content and a living comment. So a partial media is not a topic for us, because we avoid all actions who are under the suspicion, who can be under suspicion to interfere in the freedom of expression.
I completely agree with you, Manfred, and your emphasis on ethical behavior. I've listened to you saying this now for 7 or 8 years, and you're absolutely right. It is at the forefront of good journalism. Daniela, you wanted to say something?
I just wanted to disagree on the issue of definition. And once again, I just wanted to point out, I think we all agree that transparency is one of the most, and being transparent is one of the most important tasks. And I mean, we do define journalism for our work every day. And I guess everybody in the press council does define journalism. So we should make it transparent what we mean when we talk about journalism. That's my point. And I think from the point of view of a press council or also from a press club, ethical journalism is a pleonasm. Because when we talk about journalism, we talk about ethical journalism. That's the first point. And then I have a very small question to Alexander Watzlawick. Alexander, I wanted to know if you had any complaints about this topic of intervention from the Prime Minister or from his office.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with you. I think also that journalism should be responsible and ethical. So I would also not differentiate between journalism and ethical journalism, but rather between journalism and something else. And I disagree also to the aspect that the audience is deciding what is journalism, because then you would have bloggers or YouTubers or whoever. They have a big audience, but I'm not sure if they are journalists always. Yeah. So I think you should have some other rules for deciding if it's journalism or it's not. And we have that problem with this right-wing media. As Elin said, they have the dress of journalism, but they don't do journalism. But at the same time, our Senates decided to take them into account because they are dressing up like journalists, and the public sees them as media outlets. And so we think there is a need to say that this is not correct what they do, and it's not, it's a breach of code what they do, even if they ignore us and our code of ethics completely. But it's important to inform the public and to be transparent that this is not right. Yeah, and
Alex, the title of this discussion includes the word propaganda, and I think you will agree that there is a distinction, a clear distinction to be made between editorially driven journalism and propaganda. Propaganda misuses accuracy, misuses truth. It creates false stories, etc. Whereas journalism which is driven by an ideological position can easily maintain the integrity of journalism. It's an important distinction.
Sometimes we're also deciding on propaganda as a press council because we think there is a need to say that it is propaganda. Yeah? And to your question, just one sentence, Daniela, we didn't receive any complaints on this specific problem. And I think the problem is also that then an editor-in-chief should come to us and give us some evidence, or you have to record the phone call or something like that. I mean, I have heard a lot of rumors from journalists that this is happening from the editorial departments and so on, but we have never had a specific complaint.
Elin, you want to get in there, I think, did you?
I come to you with a lot of cases. I will do that in the future. Sorry, I just wanted to say to Alex, I will do that in the future because it happens all the time.
Yeah, okay. So, if you have a specific case, you can prove it, then come to us and we will deal with it, of course.
So this conference today can generate some business for us all here. Elin, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, it's about the definition or not of journalism. I think that was one of the first discussions way back when I was a part of the International Federation of Journalists. We had that discussion back then, and then we were all skeptic, I think, about defining and maybe too narrow what journalism is. But today, I think we need to be much more explicit on how we think good journalism is. That doesn't mean that we need to have the same exact definition as a framework, but we need to talk and communicate the ethical principle that gives the good quality journalism.
Peter Kappen, you wanted to say something?
Just to make clear that Ellen made the same difference between journalism and good journalism. And that's what we do every day. Some years ago, we received a complaint of a vlogger, and his video on YouTube was linked by other traditional media, and we accepted the complaints against the traditional media, online media, but also against the vlogger himself. Because in our eyes, this was journalism, but it's very difficult to define in strict ways which posts or which blogs will we see as journalism or not. And that's the reason why I say I know there are academic definitions of journalism, but that for us as press councils, it must be practical and workable. And I think that there it's better to decide case by case what is journalism. And then I follow Elin's argue that, yeah, we have to make clear if this vlog, for instance, was good journalism, was ethical journalism. And that's what I mean by saying we do this every day by making it clear in our ethical codes and in our judgments.
We just have over 5 minutes left in this discussion, so I'd like to go back to our 4 original speakers and get a final comment from them. Daniela, maybe you might go first.
Okay, as I said earlier, I think what is the really most important thing is we have to form an alliance with the audience, which means making transparent what we are talking about, what our standards are, and why journalism is important, because we can't rely on governments to support independent journalism.
Tomasz, would you have any final thoughts on this discussion?
Yes, I would like to thank you for the distinction you made just before between propaganda and editorial-driven journalism. Because at our work at zackzack, we are definitely not impartial, but we adhere to a journalistic code of ethics. So we always strive for the best obtainable version of the truth, and we use the tools that are used by journalists to do it. I think that transparency, Daniela, you just said it, is a very important aspect of that. So we always make our standpoint important, and I think more media outlets should do that because they all have a point of view, and they should state more clearly to the audience what that point of view is exactly.
I couldn't agree with you more. Elin, can we get a final remark from you, please?
Well, I think that our main task, like I started with, is to defend and explain journalism to the public. And we have to do that in a much more consistent and better way than before. And I think it can change also the role of our media council, at least, from being solely handling of complaints to be much more out there to educate and to explain and to communicate with the public to explain this. And one of our main strategies right now is, for example, to make a new tool out of all the different conclusions from our press council, so it can be a useful tool for both journalists and editors, but as well as the complainers and the public, and as a part of that work.
Thank you, Elin. And finally, Balázs, last remarks from you.
Thank you, Peter. I'd like to refer back to what Daniela said, and I very much agree that I think the press and the audience should kind of create a new alliance, and we need to make a new connection. In the past decade, somehow the audience and the press, the distance in between has grown, and we need to make steps to get closer to the audience. Trust is the key word here, because there are a lot of people who are interested in undermining this trust. But if we are in alliance with the audience, and I think that's where press councils may find one new role for them. They can be an intermediate to, we need to become kind of these messengers of trust in between the audience and us, because that trust will be kind of our vaccine until against these attempts to undermine the credibility in ethical media.
Thank you, Balázs. Just to conclude, the old-fashioned expression, the media as the fourth estate, holding to account those in power and those with privilege, if that is central to what journalism does, then I think journalism continues to have a valued role in all our societies. At that point, I'd like to hand now back to Alex, who will conclude this little session.
Yeah, thank you very much, Peter, for doing the moderation, and thank you to the panelists for being with us.